Something extraordinary is happening inside North America's auto industry, and almost nobody saw it coming. A company that once believed it could bend Canada to its will is now scrambling to undo the most catastrophic strategic mistake it has ever made. General Motors didn't just miscalculate, they underestimated an entire country. They misread the workers who built their vehicles, the government that funded their ambitions, and the economic storm that would hit them when they decided to walk away. They thought Canada would simply accept it. They thought the people they abandoned would suffer quietly. And they thought Ottawa would never dare challenge a corporation with the size, history, and political influence of GM. But this isn't the Canada of 10 years ago. This is a nation operating with a new understanding of sovereignty, power, and leverage. When GM betrayed its commitments, Canada didn't bow. It pushed back harder than the auto giants of Detroit ever imagined. And that pushback didn't just expose GM, it exposed the entire relationship between Canadian workers, American corporations, and the future of North American manufacturing. This is the story of how one company's decision triggered a chain reaction, how Melanie Joly flipped the balance of power, and how Canada quietly proved it is no longer anybody's backyard. General Motors believed it could make a clean exit, shut down the Cami plant in Ingersoll, lay off over 1,200 people, and then simply move on. For years, GM had received billions in Canadian support. Billions meant to build a future for workers, not a parachute for an American corporate giant. The company accepted every subsidy, every loan, every ounce of goodwill handed to it. Yet, when it came time to honor the promise, they didn't hesitate. They walked away. The decision didn't merely shut down a production line. It hit the heart of a community whose entire identity revolved around the plant. Ingersoll wasn't just home to an industrial site. It was a town built around it. Families had stayed through good years and bad years. Workers had helped GM survive downturns, supply shocks, recessions, but GM didn't return that loyalty. On October 21st, 2025, their intentions became brutally clear. The Cami facility wasn't temporarily paused as workers had been led to believe. It was done permanently. No new model, no restart, no transition plan, nothing. The shockwave was immediate. But what GM failed to understand was this: Canada wasn't going to accept betrayal quietly. A different kind of country stood on the other side of that decision, one ready to show that commitments come with consequences. But what Ottawa unleashed next stunned Detroit far more than any tariff threat that came before. 3 days after GM's shutdown announcement, Canada detonated an economic weapon the world barely knew existed: the auto diminishment framework, a technical sounding policy. But behind that name was something far more lethal than corporate lobbyists expected. It was designed for this exact situation, rewarding companies that keep jobs in Canada and punishing those that don't. Ottawa cut GM's duty-free import quota by precisely 24.2%. That number may look small, but its impact was massive. Every GM vehicle built in the United States and sent into Canada now triggered a 25% tariff, a penalty that instantly wiped out the company's profit margins. Overnight, US-made GM vehicles became thousands of dollars more expensive the moment they crossed the border. And GM wasn't alone. Stellantis, after shifting Jeep production to Illinois, was slammed with a 50% cut to their privileges. It was surgical. It was controlled, and it was unmistakably deliberate. This wasn't a tantrum. It wasn't a political outburst. It was a message written in the only language corporate giants truly understand: price. Canada essentially declared, break your commitments and you lose your privileges. Corporations across the continent blinked, because this wasn't how Canada reacted in the past. This was something entirely different. But the roots of this confrontation stretch back years before the tariffs were pulled. To understand the magnitude of GM's betrayal, you have to go back to 2022, when the company promised Canada the moon. GM pitched the BrightDrop EV program as a long-term revolution in clean manufacturing, a stable job creator, a generational investment. Governments listened, workers trusted, and the billions poured in. EV production wasn't just an industrial project. It was supposed to be Canada's entry point into the global future of clean transportation. But reality arrived in April 2025. GM claimed weak demand and temporary adjustments. Workers held on, believing their company. They'd done so in the past, after all. They stayed loyal. They waited. They hoped. Those hopes crumbled when the plant completely died in May. The silence from Detroit in the months that followed was louder than any announcement. Workers had no guidance, no clarity, no future. Summer faded into fall. GM said nothing. A promise worth billions collapsed in less than a year. And when October arrived, the truth came out. GM wasn't suspending production. They were abandoning it. But while Detroit stayed quiet, Ottawa was preparing something far more precise. Melanie Joly didn't improvise. She didn't yell. She didn't threaten. She acted. Alongside Francois-Philippe Champagne, she issued a joint statement that cut straight through corporate ambiguity. GM and Stellantis breached their commitments. No softness, no diplomatic varnish. The companies had received Canadian taxpayer support and failed to uphold their side of the deal. Then the real shock arrived. Joly's team dispatched official letters, cold, sharp, and unforgiving. Stellantis was warned that their legally binding commitments were enforceable. Clawbacks were on the table. GM was ordered to produce a real plan, a new vehicle for CAMI with firm timelines within 15 days. This wasn't symbolic. It was policy weaponized with precision. Workers were invited to the table, executives were summoned, and the message delivered in those meetings was brutal. Restore your commitments or face the consequences. No evasions, no public relations spin, no corporate shields. For the first time in decades, Ottawa was in the driver's seat, and that's when the panic began spreading through Detroit. GM underestimated how rapidly costs could explode. A vehicle that cost $45,000 to build in the US suddenly cost $56,000 the moment it crossed the border into Canada. Dealerships couldn't sell them, customers balked, inventory gathered dust on lots. Sales managers in Michigan and Ohio started calling headquarters demanding answers. Meanwhile, European competitors faced none of these new penalties. They sold freely. GM couldn't. Ford executives took notice. Stellantis leadership scrambled. Supply chain models were rewritten. Analysts at HQ ran simulations showing the same conclusion. Restarting production in Canada might be cheaper than weathering permanent tariffs. The math told the story clearly. Every day the tariffs remained in place. GM bled millions. This wasn't a political stunt. It was a structural blow, and behind all those numbers were the people who suffered the most. Because while GM was recalculating profits, workers were recalculating their lives. Behind every industrial shutdown stands a worker whose entire world turns upside down. Imagine being a single mother in Ingersoll. 12 years on the line. Every shift, every overtime shift, every weekend worked went toward building a future for her kids. GM wasn't just an employer. It was the foundation of her life. Then came May, temporary layoff. She tightened her budget, cut back on everything, trusted her employer of over a decade. Then October arrived, permanent closure, no guidance, no answers, no future. Inflation made groceries unbearable, rent stayed high, benefits uncertain. Every bill felt heavier than the last. And while corporations discussed long-term transitions, she counted every dollar to survive week to week. This is the part of the story analysts forget, but it's the heart of the issue. Melanie Joly's retaliation wasn't about politics. It was about people like her, workers who gave decades of their lives to the industry and asked for only one thing in return: honesty. And that's why what happened next shocked the entire auto industry. Canada's actions didn't just cause discomfort, they caused absolute panic. Within 3 weeks, Ford began reconsidering its Canadian plans. Stellantis quietly replaced its Canadian CEO. GM reached out privately to Ontario to discuss returning to Ingersoll. Suddenly, corporations that once treated Canada as an afterthought were now calling Unifor asking, "What do we need to do to fix this?" Executives who once dictated terms were now asking for meetings. The corporations that once held the leverage were now losing it. Why? Because Canada proved it wasn't afraid to enforce the rules. When the tariffs hit, when the ultimatum landed, when their profit models collapsed, Detroit realized Canada wasn't bluffing. And every global corporation with a presence in Canada began paying attention. GM didn't admit defeat publicly, but their actions made it crystal clear. They had miscalculated the Canadian government. But this moment was about more than one plant. It was about a rewriting of power across a nation. For decades, Canada lived under a quiet assumption that the biggest corporations, especially the ones based in the United States, would always have the upper hand. If workers pushed too hard, companies threatened to leave. If governments hesitated to hand out subsidies, executives reminded them that Mexico was cheaper. And for years, that strategy worked. Workers accepted less. Communities lived in uncertainty. And Ottawa often found itself reacting instead of leading. But what happened in the GM crisis shattered that old balance forever. When Melanie Joly enforced the tariff reductions, when she issued a cold ultimatum with exact deadlines and real consequences, something shifted at the national level. For the first time in a long time, Canada demonstrated that it was no longer willing to let corporations write the rules. Instead, Ottawa was setting the terms and enforcing them without blinking. This new approach isn't anti-business, it's pro-AC accountability. It rewards companies that invest in Canada and build stable jobs, and it punishes those that take public money and walk away. That clarity, that consistency is exactly what corporations claim to want. Yet they never expected Canada to wield it so effectively. And here's the irony. Even though companies don't like strict rules, they respect governments that enforce them. They can plan around predictable consequences. They can't plan around chaos. And Joly's actions prove that Canada is done operating from a place of fear. It now operates from principle. Workers finally feel like someone is standing up for them. Communities feel like their future isn't dependent on boardrooms in Detroit. And corporations finally understand that the era of exploiting Canada's goodwill is over. Canada is no longer Detroit's backyard. It's an independent economic force. And this showdown with GM proved it to the world. The showdown between Canada and GM wasn't just a business dispute. It was a moment that revealed who truly holds power in today's economy. GM believed it could take billions in public support, shut down a community, and walk away without consequences. But Canada proved something the world had long forgotten. This country is no longer afraid to enforce its own rules. Melanie Joly didn't just respond. She redefined the entire relationship between corporations and the Canadian people by pulling tariff privileges, issuing legal ultimatums, and defending workers with unmatched clarity. She showed that sovereignty isn't just a word used in speeches. It's a principle measured by action. For the first time in years, workers saw a government willing to fight for them. Corporations saw a nation that refuses to be pushed around. And global companies took notice, realizing Canada isn't simply a market. It's a force with expectations, rules, and the resolve to enforce them. GM may have triggered the crisis, but Canada used it to send a message that echoed far beyond one factory. Commitments matter, workers matter, and no company, no matter how large, gets to rewrite the rules after taking public money. This wasn't the end of a conflict, it was the beginning of a new era, one where Canada stands firm, where corporations think twice before breaking promises, and where economic power finally shifts back toward the people who build the country every single day. And if this is just the opening chapter, then the next phase of Canada's strategy will reshape everything we thought we knew about North American manufacturing. Stay tuned because Northern Pulse will be here to cover every